From religion to wrestling, gumbo to grits, politics to poetry, and all things Southern in between, this is Take on the South. Produced by the Institute for Southern Studies and hosted by the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina, Take on the South examines the highs and lows of the American South, examines the truths and fictions of the country's most distinctive region, and picks the brains of some of its most accomplished students. To understand the South, you need to take it on, and that's what we'll be doing. Join us as we take on the South. Today on Take on the South, we examine one of the most widespread, pernicious, and debilitating forms of labor ever to scar the human and geographic landscape of the American South. That system of labor was known as sharecropping. The clinical definition of sharecropping is this. Sharecropping is a legal arrangement with regard to agricultural land in which a landowner allows a tenant to use the land in return for a share of the crops produced on that land. But that definition obscures so much of the human history implicated in the system. After all, sharecropping, a largely post-Civil War development, one lasting well into the 20th century and even today, was made by people in particular historical contexts. And it is in those contexts that we discover the true nature of sharecropping. This is a deeply human story and one we need to understand. To help us on the road to that understanding, today we have on the show the author of a new book on the topic. The title of that book is Driven to the Field, Sharecropping in Southern Literature, published by the University of Virginia Press in 2023, and the author is Professor David A. Davis. Professor Davis demonstrates how sharecropping emerged, endured for a century, and continues to resonate in American culture. And he does this by analyzing literary portrayals of this system to explain how it defined the culture of the South. Dr. Davis is Director of Fellowships and Scholarships, Professor of English, Associate Director of the Spencer B. King Jr. Center for Southern Studies, and soon to be Director of their Honors College at Mercer University. He is the author of World War I and Southern Modernism and has published more than 40 articles and book chapters. He is the chair of the Thomas Robertson Prize for Southern Literature Committee, faculty advisor to the Stamps Scholars Program, the editor of the Malcolm Lester Phi Beta Kappa Lectures on Liberal Arts and Public Life, and a good and fine editor of other people's work. David, welcome to Take on the South.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark.
This is a really interesting book, and I would advise and encourage every listener to get themselves a copy. Before we get into the essence of what you're doing, can you just tell us, and I gave a brief, very clinical definition of sharecropping, but could you tell us what sharecropping was kind of historically, where it came from, how did it change over time?
Yes, very good question. Sharecropping emerged initially to solve an expedient problem. After the Civil War, after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution are passed, slavery is illegal. But the foundation of the American economy is still predicated upon the production of cotton. So there was an emergent need to restart the process of harvesting and selling cotton on the international market. Initially, the solution was for the Freedmen's Bureau to negotiate wage labor contracts between landowners and laborers. And initially, these contracts would have put people back into the fields working in gangs under the direction of supervisors. This, however, was problematic because the formerly enslaved people chafed at the idea of working under supervisors in conditions that were almost exactly the conditions that they had worked in under slavery. For many of them, their goal was to have their own farms and to grow their own crops. It was also problematic for the landowners because, well, they had land, but little access to liquid money. And it also meant that they had less control over the laborers in the fields. So sharecropping emerged as a solution to a problem. It gave the people who were working the land a bit more autonomy and independence, control over their own piece of land, and it gave the landowners more control over the people who were working in the fields. But that expedient solution was soon ingrained into a corpus of black codes and Jim Crow practices and legal complications that gave all of the social and economic control to the landowners. So it became rife with exploitation, and very quickly it effectively replicated the conditions of slavery in a system that was, well, not exactly slavery, but very far from freedom.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, so you've got the cotton, you don't have the labor. Sharecropping is perceived to be the solution, and in the kind of abstract, I suppose it is, right? But what you're saying is that the abstract then gets absorbed into the social and historical fabric that reproduces all these asymmetries and inequalities, and that's why it becomes such an exploitative and pernicious system. Were there any other alternatives, David, immediately after the Civil War to sharecropping?
Good question. The most obvious alternative was wage labor. So to pay workers in fields on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis for their work. The Freedmen's Bureau attempted to negotiate wage labor contracts between landowners and laborers, but this process lacked a great deal of enforcement. It was not socially well accepted. Remember, we're talking about a cultural system that's evolving immediately in the aftermath of the Civil War, a very dynamic and highly contentious system. And so there wasn't much of buy-in either from landowners or laborers. There wasn't a great deal of trust between the former Confederates and the Union officials who were supervising the Freedmen's Bureau under Reconstruction. So it wasn't a tenable solution. Sharecropping fit more into the ruts that had been deeply ingrained into the Southern society at the time that put control in the hands of landowners. Now, these ruts, however, proved to be the foundation for a system of exploitation that's going to last for another century.
Yeah, and that, I think, is one of the key takeaways from your book, as I understand it, is sharecropping is so embedded in the fabric of Southern life for such a long time. And so everybody knows about sharecropping, right? I mean, it is so widely understood and practiced that it almost goes without commentary. And one of the functions of your book is to show that, yes, it is widely used, it's everywhere, it's ubiquitous, and yet it's a bit shadowy too, right? And this is why you access it through literature. Am I getting this right?
Okay. Yes, I think so. So millions of people worked as sharecroppers in the century between 1865 and 1965. In fact, in many parts of the South, the majority of land is worked by people who do not own their own land, people who are tenants on other people's land. The majority of cotton that is produced, the majority of tobacco that is produced, the majority of sugar cane is produced by exploited sharecropping agricultural labor. It is, yes, ubiquitous throughout the South for nearly a century. But as you indicate, we haven't paid an enormous amount of attention to the culture of sharecropping. If we think about the stacks and stacks of books that have been written about the history of slavery in the U.S. South, we see thousands of texts that have explored every potential nuance of the culture and history of enslavement, which is extremely important. However, what I'm suggesting here is that sharecropping is an extension, an outgrowth of slavery. And it's extremely important to us today because it bridges the temporal and cultural space from the end of slavery through the civil rights movement and up to today. It helps to explain why we continue to live with demographic, political, and social problems that are ultimately based on the culture of slavery in the U.S. South. How do we get from 1865 to today? Well, the answer is sharecropping. And so my book brings our attention back to the cultural experience of sharecropping, and to the lived experience of sharecropping. And in my book, I analyze more than 100 novels and other texts that describe and portray that system as it evolved in the century from the end of the Civil War up through to the beginning of the 21st century.
So you're reading a lot here, a lot of novels, beginning in the Reconstruction period. Do these novels kind of front and center and foreground sharecropping, or is it a quiet presence? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of variety here. How would you characterize the novels that you? I mean, how do you choose the novels that you read about sharecropping if it's not always front and center and a bit quiet?
The truth is, it's often front and center.
Okay.
Beginning with the Reconstruction period, starting with, for example, the novels of Albion Touré, who was a Reconstruction official working in North Carolina, who wrote The Fool's Errand and Bricks Without Straw. Both of these texts are directly describing the emergence of sharecropping and the challenges, successes, and failures of the Freedmen's Bureau. And that establishes for us a paradigm that we see consistently through for more than a century of texts that are describing life and agricultural labor in the South. I would contend that you cannot write a novel about the South between 1865 and 1965 that doesn't at least gesture toward sharecropping. And in fact, of the more than 100 texts that I discuss, the bulk of them focalize on the experiences of sharecroppers. However, most of these texts have been marginalized. They're not often read, they're not often discussed, they're not often engaged with, which allows us to overlook the experience of sharecropping. But if we focus our attention back on sharecropping, we'll see exactly how impactful it was on life in the South. And reading more of these texts, marginal though they may be, about the culture of sharecropping, makes the texts that we do focus our attention on, say the works of William Faulkner or Eudora Welty, that much more significant. It provides the essential context for the social dynamics of life in the South that these more prominent texts are describing. It gives them more nuance, more substance. We see why the power dynamics in these works are so important.
Well, was there a spike in novels at a certain point dealing with sharecropping, or is it fairly a sort of a drip? There's a few published every year. Is there a concentration at any point?
There is a concentration. So early 20th century, as American publishing is exploding. From the 1920s to the 1940s, there are scores of books about sharecropping published in a number of genres. There are novels by African American authors that are describing sharecropping as a potential means for uplift. There are a number of novels by white writers who are portraying sharecroppers who are attempting to climb the agricultural ladder from sharecropping to tenantry to small landowning to eventually being landowners employing their own sharecroppers. And then during the Great Depression, there is a spate of novels that I describe as proletarian sharecropper novels that are using the experiences of sharecroppers to describe the experience of oppressed, exploited workers in the United States. The sharecropping novels do begin to peter out a bit as sharecropping itself begins to wane following World War II, but we still see the representation of sharecropping in novels that are describing the historical sweep of the U.S. South following World War II. Think, for example, of The Third Life of Grange Copeland by Alice Walker, or Ernest Gaines's novel, The Autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. So we do definitely see sharecropping continue to have a relevant space in Southern literature well into the 20th and all the way up to the 21st century.
Interesting. Can you give it? What's the most famous sharecropping novel that you can think of? Something that listeners would say, "Oh, really? That book?"
Right. Well, that's an interesting question. To answer that, I'll point out a couple of texts that are, well, very famous and are very much about sharecropping, but that sublimate sharecropping within the novels.
Okay.
So 2 books were published in 1936. Both of these books portray the experience of Southerners through the Civil War into the Reconstruction period and moving up to the 20th century. So they're both describing the social and political and economic dynamics of this period of time when sharecropping is emerging. They're both published in the 1930s, at a time when depictions of sharecroppers are ubiquitous and prominent in American media because of a direct propaganda campaign by the U.S. government to arouse attention and support for New Deal interventions to support the plight of sharecroppers in the U.S. South. However, in both of these books, sharecroppers are relegated deep into the background. In fact, they're only, in the 2 books, sharecropping is only directly mentioned one time.
Okay, so you've set this up and you hit it out of the ballpark. What are the 2 books?
Well, they are well known.
Okay.
The first is Gone with the Wind, and the second is Absalom, Absalom.
All right.
And so if we think, though, about sharecropping as the pernicious and ubiquitous system of exploitative labor that is being used by both Scarlett O'Hara and Thomas Sutpen to reproduce their social standing after the Civil War, then we begin to see, where people are focusing their attention is on the big house and not on the fields. Right. What happens if we shift our focus to look at what's happening in the fields? That's where we find the really significant issues.
So you're foregrounding the background, right? You're extracting that bit that's behind the house, and you're saying, hang on a minute. Let's look at the quiet bits and turn up the volume a bit, right?
Exactly.
Okay. All right. It's a rich book that you've written, and it deals with all sorts of interesting things, trade unions and the unionization of sharecropping. We can maybe talk about that in a bit. But if you had to offer your kind of 2 or 3 basic conclusions or main theses in this book, things that you want people to take away from the book, what would those be, David?
I think the first is the simplest and most radical.
Okay.
Sharecropping was important. If we just need to start the conversation there, because it is so frequently overlooked in our conversations, not just about literature or literary history, but in our conversations about Southern history and about the evolution of the South to this present moment. The demographics of the U.S. South continue to follow the contours of the sharecropping economy. Race and class asymmetries continue to follow the contours of the sharecropping economy. Social problems such as illiteracy rates, teen pregnancy rates, mortality rates continue to follow the contours of the sharecropping economy. We cannot understand the contemporary South without having some attention to and understanding of the effects of sharecropping.
One of the reasons I love this topic in this book is because it's what my dad called the history of the bloody obvious, right? It's so obvious that nobody touches it. And he said that about my way. So time, surely people have written about time. Well, no, but it's so ubiquitous, and yet we take it for granted. And it has a kind of cultural resonance that's not being investigated by historians. Can you, before we get into the second thesis, can you suggest why historians and scholars generally have just decided, unwittingly or wittingly, not to look at this? I mean, is there a particular reason?
I don't know.
It's perplexing, isn't it?
Yeah, to answer that question, I can only speculate.
Okay.
And my speculation would be that we tend to focus historical studies and literary studies on more specific topics.
Yeah, I agree.
Smaller periods of time, more particular populations, issues that are somewhat more tangible. Yeah. And to think about the scale and sweep of sharecropping is a little bit, complicated. There's also the fact that the history and culture of slavery is such a profound moral issue.
Yeah.
Sharecropping moves us into a much more nebulous and gray space. Exactly what is the harm? What is the wrong here? Well, if we begin to focus on it, it becomes pretty obvious, but it's not quite as overt as the social wrong and ethical and moral sin of slavery. So this pushes us into something of a gray area. But if we begin to focus some attention here, we see the patterns, the replications, the exploitation that's inherent in the system here, and it makes the context for these more specific studies, I think, much more significant.
I also think, I'm just going to, say this. I think it takes a certain imaginative capacity to think in these broad terms, and that's what you're bringing here. And it also takes perhaps a scholar of literature to do it, because historians, you're entirely right, for various professional pressures and reasons, they tend to slice their history so that you've got a 10-year period where you can manage it because it's complex. What you've managed to do as a literary scholar is sort of transcend these discrete decades, and I think that's immensely worthwhile. So, second thesis, the takeaway, if you will.
So a key point here is that, exploitation is inherent to the system. If there is any one characteristic that makes the U.S. South distinctive, it is its historical commitment to labor exploitation. From the founding of Jamestown Plantation through to the present day. The history of slavery, the history of sharecropping, the history of post-sharecropping industrialization, the present history of agricultural labor in the U.S. South tend to fall back into these patterns of systems of exploitation.
All right, makes perfect sense. And what would be your third main takeaway?
That more detailed attention to the nuance of Southern literary history, put in context with Southern economic and social history, reveals to us the patterns and contours of lived experience in the South. In order to, we focus so much of our attention in literary studies and history studies on the people in the big house. It's crucial to understand what put them in the big house in the first place. Whose labor is actually doing the work? And if we do that, it shifts our perception of what these edifices actually signify. One of the lessons I teach all of my students in Southern Literary Studies is a plantation house is a carceral space.
Yeah.
And to the extent that we think of the plantation house as a signifier for the U.S. South, we're aligning the South as a carceral space.
Sure. Let's talk about change over time. Can you tell us about the impact of mechanization on sharecropping? I suspect it's kind of obvious, but I'm just kind of curious about when mechanization kicks in and how it impacts sharecropping.
Excellent point. So the purpose of sharecropping is to maintain a large, docile, and cheap, massive labor force that is necessary to perform the work to produce a plantation commodity crop, particularly cotton. Cotton has a long growing cycle, and it requires significant amounts of labor 3 times. At planting time in the spring, chopping during the hottest part of the summer to remove weeds from the fields, and urgently at picking time in the fall, September and October.
Urgently being the key there.
Urgently.
Right.
During the remainder of the year, cotton requires not a lot of tending, but you need to keep the labor force tied to the land for the entire cycle. Mechanization begins to obviate the need for labor at those 3 times. Tractors were really good at plowing fields and making it possible to mechanize planting. However, they were not good at mechanizing the process of chopping cotton, and it was very difficult to mechanize the process of picking cotton. So as other agricultural crops in the United States are beginning to mechanize in the late 19th and early 20th century, we still needed the large labor force to produce cotton in the U.S. South. The Rust brothers began to develop an effective spindle-based cotton picker as early as the 1920s, but it was difficult to mass produce, and it still didn't quite solve the problem of chopping cotton.
Which is what, by the way?
Chopping cotton is the process of chopping weeds with a hoe out of the fields of cotton. If the weeds grow up and overshadow the cotton plants don't grow tall enough to actually bloom and produce cotton bolls.
Gotcha.
So it's one of the 3 most important processes of growing a cotton crop. After World War II, International Harvester begins to mass produce spindle-based cotton pickers. And these move into the fields beginning in the late 1940s and 1950s. And as spindle-based pickers mechanize cotton production, we see families that had been working as sharecroppers, in many cases for generations, being rapidly displaced from their farms. There's a transitional economic paradigm that emerges beginning in 1945, where more and more families who had worked as sharecroppers on autonomous plots of land for generations are being moved into day laboring positions where they work on piecemeal contracts. Really interesting to see how this pattern replicates what the Freedmen's Bureau had attempted to negotiate in the 1860s.
Right.
By the 1950s, we see the same factories that had produced explosives during World War II are now beginning to produce fertilizers and defoliants and pesticides and herbicides that can be applied to cotton fields by airplane. So crop dusting begins to obviate the need also for chopping cotton. And so by 1965, we see sharecropping almost cease to exist throughout the U.S.
That's
South.
a rapid revolution.
It is a rapid, in the grand scheme of things, that is a rapid
20
revolution.
years or so, right?
Exactly.
Incredible.
And I would also point out that these dates are pretty significant, 1945 to 1965. I would say that the fall of sharecropping is almost essential to the emergence of the civil rights movement because it begins to concentrate the rural African American population that had been under the direct control of localized landowners more into southern cities. And the greatest successes of the civil rights movement are taking place in southern cities like Atlanta and New Orleans and Birmingham and even Columbia, which now have a preponderant African American population which has enough social, political, and economic influence to actually effectively agitate for social change.
Are you sure you're not an historian? Because you sound like it to me. I love this point. I think that's poetic, and it strikes me as entirely true, and something that allows historians to connect two things that ostensibly don't appear to be related, but you're very persuasive on this. Okay, so 65 sharecropping is pretty much moribund, right? And yet, your book takes us into the 21st century, doesn't it? What happens?
That's a good question. One would think, perhaps, that with the end of sharecropping, there's the potential and possibility for social progress in the South. That would be a really optimistic position. We see that that's not exactly what happens. We do see that there's progress in the sense that people are freed from the bonds of sharecropping exploitation, but then freed into what? In the rural South, there are very few economic opportunities that emerge out of the end of sharecropping. And so what we've seen over the past two generations, from 1965 to the present, is a consistent process of social and economic decline across much of the rural South. The same places that had been major cotton-producing locations, we've seen their economies decline. Machines do most of the work of producing cotton. Cotton production itself has moved overseas to a very large extent. And so areas of, say, North Mississippi and central Alabama and central Georgia and southern South Carolina that have been large producers of cotton have seen their populations decline, have seen their economies decline. We can see it visually and graphically, but we can also see it reflected in the literature. So the truth is, life in the South after sharecropping, life in the rural South after sharecropping, is a long declension narrative.
So you don't find sharecropping today, is that right? Or do you?
Well, we find vestiges of sharecropping today, and those forms of agricultural labor that are most difficult to mechanize. We still see forms of outrageous labor exploitation. Cotton is heavily mechanized. It's unusual to find many people actually working in cotton fields. Tobacco has declined precipitously, but those forms of agricultural production, particularly in growing vegetables, that are difficult to mechanize, that involve lots of hands-on crops, we still see outrageous labor exploitation. One example would be the enslavement of Latin American guest workers working in tomato fields in Florida in the 1990s and early 2000s that leads to the coalition of Imalaki workers, a group of people who develop a public consciousness raising campaign to demonstrate that these people are working in the conditions that don't replicate slavery, that are slavery, that are growing the tomatoes that are being sold in Publix and that are going on to hamburgers at Burger King and Wendy's. And so that focuses some attention on the plight of agricultural workers for a few minutes. But then we see, just in the past couple of years, a very similar system exposed in producing Vidalia onions in southwest Georgia. So what I would suggest is, if you want to find the legacies and vestiges of agricultural exploitation, they are there if we are just willing to look for them. But as this pattern clearly demonstrates, we are somewhat unwilling to recognize the continued extent of labor exploitation in our own midst.
Why is that, David? Why the reluctance? I mean, you're entirely right. Media do highlight this on occasion. But fundamentally, I mean, people, just from a common sense point of view, must think about where the tomatoes are coming from, right? Where the Vidalia onions are coming from. What's the kind of gestalt here? What is the kind of hesitancy, do you think, for people who go to the supermarket, buy their stuff, but don't connect it to the origin of what they're buying?
Americans love to tell themselves stories. The story that America loves is the story of the American dream. The idea that America is a country, a civilization, a society, a people built on progress. And the story of the United States is a story that extends from the city on the hill all the way through this notion that anyone here can succeed. This is a nation built on freedom and prosperity. These stories, well, they counteract the prevailing narrative of America. The notion that our success, our prosperity, our freedom is actually directly predicated upon the oppression and exploitation of someone else, that doesn't fit. Therefore, we are willingly, perhaps deliberately blind to these experiences and to the people that, well, we exploit every time we eat a hamburger, or every time we buy a t-shirt, or every time we buy a cell phone. We are deliberately overlooking the experiences of the people who made that product possible.
Let's talk briefly about pushback. Sharecroppers established unions in the 1930s and 1940s,
Correct.
Is that correct? Can you talk a little bit about those unions and how successful were they?
Very good question. So during the Great Depression, the experiences of sharecroppers were frequently co-opted by different groups who had an agenda. One of these groups is the federal government. It has an agenda to support and promote New Deal interventions. And so sharecroppers were part of a propaganda campaign. Another group is social scientists who are studying living conditions in the South as a sort of a laboratory for social problems and who are pathologizing and diagnosing the U.S. South. One of the few places where we see sharecroppers speaking for themselves is in the unionization movements that emerge in Arkansas and in Alabama. In Arkansas, a group called the Southern Tenant Farmers Union originates, and in Alabama, another group called the Sharecroppers Union originates. And in these two groups, we see sharecroppers organizing for their own needs to galvanize labor action to go, well, on strike, to stop picking cotton, to, at great risk to themselves, challenge the landowners. When I say great risk to themselves, landowners tended to respond to labor actions among sharecroppers with extreme violence. In the context of the Great Depression, however, when there are labor movements going on all across the country, we can see a much broader impact. These two groups managed to attract a significant amount of national attention and actually develop, particularly in the case of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union in Arkansas, a bit of federal support. But there's an inherent challenge with organizing a union of sharecroppers. Sharecropping tended to be a racialized system of labor. Up to the 1920s, the majority of sharecroppers in the South were African American. With economic decline in the 1920s, 1930s, that paradigm shifts so that many small white landowners are pushed into sharecropping. So by 1930, the majority of sharecroppers in the U.S. South are white people. This makes it a very delicate political issue because, well, white people in the South can vote, whereas in the 1930s, black people in the South effectively could not vote. So these unions are effective to the extent that they organize opposition among white laborers against the landowners, but they are inherently fraught because of the oppositionality between white sharecroppers and black sharecroppers, which makes it easy for landowners to simply use one group of laborers against the other. What's really fascinating about this whole process is how obvious it makes the dynamics of race, class, and labor in the South.
I think that you're helping initiate and on the kind of riding wave of reinvigorating our memory of such a fundamental part of not just Southern but U.S. history, sharecropping. And even in really popular novels, I'm thinking of John Grisham's The Painted House. This is all about sharecropping. The whole thing is about sharecropping. And I think this is an immensely valuable act in erasing amnesia. David, any last thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners about sharecropping and your book?
The key takeaway message is that sharecropping matters. If we're going to understand how the South continues to exist as a distinctive region, if we're going to understand the foundation, the roots of the social problems that continue to challenge us as Southerners, if we're going to make progress into this century, then we need to understand where the problems originate, how they are embedded in our past, and what makes us, well, the South.
David Davis, author of Driven to the Field, thank you for being on Take on the South. That was our Take on the South. Let us know yours. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at U of SC South. Take on the South is produced by Matt Simmons of the Institute for Southern Studies. Special thanks to Professor Dave Garner of the University of South Carolina School of Music for composing our music. Tune in next time for another Take on the South.